On a remote island in Siberia's Lake Tereko, the walls of Por-Bajin rise from the ground in perfect geometric order. Yet, almost no one can explain why such a massive fortress was built in a place so isolated, or why it seems to have been abandoned almost as soon as it was finished. Even the latest scientific dating has only made the puzzle more difficult, turning one lonely ruin into a question with no satisfying answer. That mystery is only one fragment of a much larger collection waiting ahead. Across 22 astonishing cases, you'll encounter structures that seem to defy their own era, disappearances that erased entire communities, objects with no clear purpose, and discoveries that continue to divide archaeologists, historians, and scientists. Some have been studied for centuries. Others have become stranger as new technology uncovered evidence nobody expected to find. Every chapter leaves another crack in the story we thought the past was telling. The deeper we go, the harder certainty becomes. So we'll start on an island where the questions begin long before anyone arrived looking for answers. In the far south of Siberia, in the Tuva Republic, a lake called Tereko sits ringed by mountains that stay snow-capped for most of the year. At its center, on a small island barely larger than a few city blocks, rise the rectangular walls of a structure archaeologists call Por-Bajin, a name that simply means clay house in the local Tuvan language, because no one has ever been entirely certain what the site was actually built to be. From above, the layout is unmistakably deliberate. Symmetrical courtyards, a formal central axis, walls of rammed earth and timber, enclosing an area of roughly 3.5 hectares, all positioned with a precision that suggests planners who understood architecture, astronomy, and considerable engineering ambition. Radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology place its construction firmly in the 8th century AD, most likely around 777, during the height of the Uyghur Khaganate, a nomadic empire that controlled much of Central Asia at the time. That much is reasonably settled. Almost everything else about the site is not. The layout resembles, in broad strokes, the formal architecture of Tang Dynasty China, leading many archaeologists to conclude Por-Bajin may have been built as a palace, perhaps for a Uyghur Khagan seeking to project imperial legitimacy through Chinese-style construction, or as a Manichaean monastery, since the Uyghur elite had adopted Manichaeism as a state religion around this same period. Both theories have genuine support. Manichaean religious symbolism has been noted in some architectural details, and the site's isolation on a remote island would suit either a fortified royal retreat or a secluded religious community equally well. But here is where the certainty dissolves. Extensive excavations, carried out by Russian archaeological teams beginning in earnest in 2007, have found remarkably little evidence that anyone actually lived inside these walls for any meaningful length of time. There are no substantial deposits of household waste, no worn thresholds suggesting years of foot traffic, no accumulated layers of daily habitation that a palace or monastery occupied across generations would ordinarily leave behind. Some structures show signs of fire damage from what appears to have been a single significant event. Yet even that destruction doesn't seem to align with a site that had been in continuous, heavily populated use beforehand. This absence has left researchers with a stranger puzzle than a simple identification problem. If Por-Bajin was a palace, why does it show so little evidence of a court actually residing there? If it was a monastery, where are the traces of the daily religious life such a community would have generated over years or decades? Some archaeologists have proposed it may have functioned only briefly, perhaps interrupted by political upheaval within the Uyghur Khaganate itself, which did face internal instability and eventual collapse by the mid-9th century. Others have suggested it may have served a purely ceremonial function, used only for occasional rituals or gatherings rather than permanent habitation, which would explain the architectural sophistication without the accompanying signs of ordinary daily life. There is also the matter of the island's connection to the shore, evidence of a causeway or bridge that seems to have been deliberately built and, by some interpretations, deliberately dismantled or left incomplete, a detail that has never been fully explained by any of the leading theories. What was this place actually for? And why does it show every sign of enormous investment paired with almost no sign of ordinary use? Was it abandoned before its purpose was ever fulfilled, or did that purpose simply leave no trace archaeologists have learned to recognize? The walls remain standing on their quiet island, precise and empty, still keeping whatever answer their builders knew. Southwest from that empty Siberian island, across a continent and back some 1,500 years earlier, the land itself forms the mystery instead of anything built on top of it. In the windswept basalt plateau of the Golan Heights, visible clearly only from above, 5 concentric rings of stacked stone spiral outward across nearly 150 meters, forming a structure so large that the Bedouin, who lived among its ruins for centuries, named it Rujm el-Hiri, the stone heap of the wild cat. The scale alone sets it apart from almost anything else in the region. An estimated 40,000 tons of basalt rock were stacked, without mortar, into these rings, some walls still standing over 2 meters high after thousands of years of exposure. At the center sits a tumulus, a mounded cairn that once concealed a burial chamber, excavated by archaeologists in the 1960s, and again, more thoroughly, in subsequent decades. Radiocarbon dating and the archaeological layers surrounding the site place its construction somewhere in the early Bronze Age, roughly 3,500 to 3,000 BC, making it contemporary with the earliest stages of Egyptian dynastic civilization and predating Stonehenge's most famous phases by several centuries. What makes Rujm el-Hiri genuinely strange isn't simply its age or its size, but the fact that its layout doesn't correspond neatly to any settlement pattern archaeologists would expect to find nearby. There are no substantial traces of a town or city large enough to have organized the labor required to move this much stone. No dense residential remains in the immediate vicinity that would explain who exactly built something on this scale, or why they chose this particular spot on an exposed, relatively remote plateau, rather than closer to reliable water sources and arable land. The site's astronomical alignment has drawn the most sustained scholarly attention. Researchers, including Israeli archaeoastronomer Yonathan Mizrachi, have documented that specific gaps in the outer rings align with the sunrise on the summer solstice, and that other openings correspond with the equinoxes, suggesting the structure functioned, at least in part, as a calendar of sorts, a way of marking the changing seasons with a precision that required careful, sustained observation of the sky over what must have been years, if not generations, before construction even began. This kind of astronomical sophistication in a structure this early has led some researchers to describe it as evidence of a far more organized, deliberate society operating in this region than the archaeological record otherwise readily reveals. But the central burial chamber complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. When archaeologists finally reached the tumulus at the heart of the rings, they found it had already been looted in antiquity, and what remained inside dated to a period nearly 1,500 years later than the surrounding rings themselves, meaning the burial mound most visitors assume was the original purpose of the site was very likely added long after the rings had already been standing, repurposing a monument whose original builders and original intent had, by that point, already faded from local memory. If the tomb came later, then what was Rujm el-Hiri actually built for in the first place, before anyone thought to bury someone important at its center? This is where the mainstream explanations begin to fracture into genuinely competing possibilities, rather than converging on a single accepted answer. Some archaeologists favor a primarily ceremonial or religious function, a gathering place for communities across the wider region to mark seasonal transitions collectively, perhaps tied to agricultural cycles even though no permanent farming settlement sat directly alongside it. Others have proposed it may have served as a boundary marker or territorial symbol, a monumental statement of presence and control over a strategically significant plateau, built by a coalition of smaller communities rather than any single settled population. Still others have suggested a funerary function from the very beginning, even if the specific tomb currently in the center was added later, replacing or supplementing earlier burials that left no surviving trace archaeologists have been able to identify with confidence. More speculative theories have proposed the site as a marker for regional gathering and pilgrimage, far exceeding anything the sparse population estimates for this period would obviously support, raising the persistent question of exactly how many people, and from how wide an area, would have needed to cooperate to move 40,000 tons of stone into such a precise, astronomically calibrated configuration. Coordinated labor on this scale typically implies some form of centralized authority, or at least a strong shared cultural motivation. Yet the early Bronze Age communities of the southern Levant are not otherwise well documented as having the kind of political organization historians would expect to be necessary for a project this ambitious. Why did a society seemingly without major nearby settlements commit to stacking tens of thousands of tons of basalt into rings precisely calibrated to the solstices? And why, over 1,000 years later, did someone choose this specific, already ancient site to bury their dead, as though the meaning of the rings had outlasted the memory of what they were originally for? The stones have held their positions for 5,000 years. They have never once explained themselves. Stones that outlasted the memory of their builders. That question doesn't stay buried in the Golan. Some 300 kilometers northeast, in the limestone hills of southeastern Turkey near the modern city of Şanlıurfa, it resurfaces in a site so old it forces archaeologists to reconsider what people without agriculture, without metal tools, without writing, were actually capable of organizing. Karahan Tepe sits within the same broader cultural sphere as its far more famous neighbor, Göbekli Tepe, roughly 35 kilometers away, and the two sites are increasingly understood as part of a much wider network of monumental construction spread across this region during the pre-pottery Neolithic period. Excavations at Karahan Tepe, conducted more intensively since 2019 under Turkish archaeologist Necmi Karul, have uncovered T-shaped limestone pillars similar to those at Göbekli Tepe, some carved directly from the surrounding bedrock rather than quarried and transported, dated to roughly 9400 to 9000 BC, meaning this site was constructed by hunter-gatherer communities more than 5,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramids, and well before most archaeologists previously believed complex monumental architecture was even possible without settled agricultural societies to support it. The most striking single feature discovered so far is a chamber researchers have nicknamed the Hall of the Pillars, or sometimes the Cave of Skulls, where 11 T-shaped pillars have been carved directly into the living rock of a partially subterranean room, surrounding a central pillar carved with a relief of a human face, one of very few genuinely representational depictions of a human figure from this early period anywhere in the archaeological record. Nearby, other carvings depict a leopard and a vulture, in a style that closely echoes the animal imagery found at Göbekli Tepe, suggesting a shared symbolic or religious vocabulary spanning multiple sites and, by extension, multiple communities across a fairly wide stretch of territory. This is where the mainstream picture starts to strain against easier assumptions. Conventional models of human social development have long held that large-scale monumental construction, the kind requiring coordinated labor from dozens or hundreds of people over extended periods, followed the development of settled agriculture, since farming produces the food surplus needed to free labor for building projects unrelated to daily survival. Karahan Tepe, along with Göbekli Tepe before it, upends that sequence directly. The people who carved these pillars, quarried this stone, and organized whatever rituals took place inside these chambers were still hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. They had not yet domesticated wheat, had not yet kept livestock, and yet somehow organized labor on a scale sophisticated enough to produce architecture that some researchers argue required specialized knowledge, planning, and social coordination previously assumed to be impossible without agricultural surplus. How, then, did a hunter-gatherer society sustain the labor force necessary for this kind of construction? Some archaeologists have proposed that sites like Karahan Tepe may have functioned as periodic gathering places, drawing dispersed hunter-gatherer bands together seasonally for shared ritual activity, with the construction itself spread out gradually over generations, rather than completed by any single, permanently resident population. This would mean the site wasn't built by a settled community at all, but by a rotating temporary confederation of groups who returned to this location repeatedly across centuries, each contributing incrementally to a shared religious project whose full significance may have shifted and evolved over that long span of use. The purpose of the pillars themselves, and the meaning of the carved animals and the singular human face at the center of that subterranean chamber, remains genuinely unresolved. Some researchers interpret the T-shaped pillars as stylized representations of human figures themselves, with the horizontal top representing arms or shoulders, suggesting the entire chamber may depict a gathering or council of ancestral or divine beings, rather than simply architectural supports. Others are more cautious about assigning specific representational meaning, noting that without written language from this period, any interpretation of intent risks projecting later religious frameworks onto a symbolic system that operated by entirely different logic we may not be equipped to fully reconstruct. There is also the question of why these sites, both at Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe, were eventually and deliberately buried by the very people who built them, filled in with rubble and sediment rather than left standing or abandoned to gradual decay. Deliberate burial suggests intent, a ritual closing of some kind. But why a community would invest such enormous labor into construction only to later invest additional labor into concealing it entirely is a question that current archaeology has not resolved with any real confidence. What kind of society, without farming, without permanent villages as archaeologists traditionally define them, organized itself around a shared symbolic vision precise enough to carve human faces and prowling leopards into bedrock walls, and then chose, generations later, to bury that vision beneath the earth again? Karahan Tepe's excavation is still ongoing, with large sections of the site still unexcavated beneath the same hills that concealed it for 11,000 years. Whatever additional chambers remain beneath that limestone may yet answer questions this first look has only managed to deepen. 11,000 years of buried limestone give way now to something far more recently carved, and far less explained by the passage of time alone. In the gentle hills of the Asuka region, south of Nara in Japan, a scatter of massive worked stone monuments sits half-sunk in rice paddies and forest slopes, cut with a geometric precision that still puzzles the engineers who study them today. The Asuka megaliths are not a single site, but a loose collection of granite monuments spread across the Asuka Mura area, generally dated to the Asuka period, roughly the 6th to 7th centuries AD, placing their creation firmly within recorded Japanese history rather than deep prehistory. This matters because, unlike many megalithic mysteries scattered across the world, these stones were carved during an era with written records, an active imperial court, and a documented Buddhist and continental cultural influence pouring in from Korea and China. And yet, remarkably, no surviving text from the period explains what several of the most striking monuments were actually built to do. The most famous of these is Ishibutai Kofun, an enormous burial mound whose massive earthen covering has eroded away over the centuries, exposing the granite megaliths beneath. Over 30 stones, weighing a combined estimated 2,300 tons, assembled into a burial chamber believed to have once housed the tomb of Soga no Umako, a powerful statesman who dominated Japanese court politics in the late 6th century. This one, at least, has a reasonably confident identification and purpose, a tomb built on a scale that reflected Umako's extraordinary political power at the time. But other monuments in the same region resist this kind of confident explanation entirely. Masuda no Iwafune, the rock ship of Masuda, is perhaps the strangest. A single, massive granite block, roughly 11 meters long and 8 meters wide, carved with 2 large rectangular depressions on its upper surface and a flat, deliberately leveled top, sitting on a hillside with no burial chamber beneath it and no clear architectural context connecting it to any known structure. Its name comes from its vague resemblance to the hull of a ship, but what it actually was built for remains genuinely unresolved, even among specialists who have studied it for generations. Theories proposed by mainstream archaeologists include the possibility that it served as a foundation stone for an observatory or astronomical marker, its flat surfaces and precise depressions potentially used to hold water for tracking celestial reflections, a technique with some precedent in East Asian astronomical practice of the period. Others have suggested it may have been an unfinished component intended for a much larger tomb structure, abandoned partway through construction for reasons no surviving record explains. Its strange carved depression simply an intermediate stage in a burial monument that was never completed. Still others propose a more straightforward function as a quarry marker or a stone earmarked for later transport and use elsewhere, its current position simply where the work was interrupted rather than where it was ultimately meant to remain. None of these explanations has achieved full consensus, and the uncertainty deepens further at nearby Sakafuneshi, another large carved stone featuring a network of channels and basins cut into its surface with clear, deliberate intent, generally interpreted as part of some kind of water-based ritual system, possibly connected to purification practices or alcohol production for ceremonial use, given the stone's local nickname referencing sake. Excavations in the surrounding area have revealed additional stone conduits and basins, suggesting a coordinated water management system tied to the monument. Yet, the specific rituals or practical processes this elaborate stonework was designed to support remain, at best, an informed guess rather than a settled fact. What makes the Asuka megaliths a genuinely distinct kind of mystery, compared to prehistoric sites where the absence of written language explains the silence, is that this silence exists despite a literate, well-documented imperial court operating in the immediate area at the very time these stones were carved. The Nihon Shoki and other early Japanese chronicles record court intrigues, succession disputes, and religious developments from this same period in considerable detail. Yet these specific monuments, apparently significant enough to justify moving stones weighing many tons into precisely engineered configurations, simply escaped documentation, or the documentation that once existed did not survive into the modern record. Why would a society capable of detailed court record-keeping leave behind such elaborate, labor-intensive stonework without a clear surviving explanation of its purpose? Was Masuda no Iwafune truly an abandoned tomb component, an astronomical tool, or something else entirely that later interpretation has simply failed to correctly categorize? Local folklore across the centuries has filled the gap with its own explanations, including legends of celestial visitors and mythological figures associated with the stones, folklore that tells us more about later generations' need for an answer than about the original builder's actual intent. The rock ship of Masuda has sat on its hillside for some 1,400 years, its carved basins holding rainwater instead of whatever it was originally meant to hold, still waiting for someone to read what its makers never bothered or were never able to write down. Carved basins built to hold something their makers never specified, that same unfinished quality, an ambitious project abandoned mid-purpose, reappears now on the steppe of southern Kazakhstan, at a site so large that satellite photographs still show its outline more clearly than any ground-level visit ever could. Akyrtas sits in the Jebel region, not far from the ancient Silk Road city of Taraz, and consists of the foundations of an enormous rectangular structure, roughly 185 by 125 meters, built from massive sandstone blocks, some individual stones weighing several tons apiece, quarried from sites reportedly located many kilometers away, and transported to this remote steppe location through means that remain only partially understood. Archaeological consensus generally dates the complex to somewhere between the 7th and 8th centuries AD, placing its construction within the era of Turkic Khaganetes that controlled this stretch of Central Asia, though some researchers have proposed dates extending slightly earlier or later, depending on how specific architectural features are interpreted. What makes Akyrtas immediately distinctive, even to visitors with no archaeological training, is the evident scale of ambition paired with the total absence of completion. The foundations suggest a structure intended to include multiple courtyards, a complex network of interior rooms, and walls thick enough to support what would have been, had it been finished, one of the largest architectural projects anywhere in the medieval Central Asian steppe. And yet nowhere on the site do the walls rise to anything resembling their intended full height. The stonework simply stops mid-construction, as though the workers building it were called away one day and never returned. Soviet-era archaeologists who conducted the first serious excavations at the site beginning in the mid-20th century proposed that Akyrtas was intended as a palace or fortified residence for a Turkic Khagan or a regional governor, its scale reflecting the political ambitions of whichever ruler commissioned it. This remains the most widely cited mainstream explanation, and it fits reasonably well with the site's location along a strategically significant stretch of the Silk Road, where a fortified residence would have projected considerable authority over trade routes passing through the region. But this explanation, however plausible, doesn't resolve the central puzzle of why construction stopped so abruptly and so completely. Building projects of this scale in the ancient and medieval world were sometimes interrupted by war, by the death of a patron, or by shifting political fortunes that left an ambitious ruler unable to complete what he'd started. Any of these explanations could account for Akyrtas's unfinished state, yet no specific historical event has been definitively linked to its abandonment. No chronicle survives describing a Khagan's death or a military catastrophe precisely coinciding with construction at this particular site, leaving historians to reason backward from the stones themselves rather than forward from any documented cause. Some researchers have proposed an entirely different function for the complex, suggesting it may have been intended not as a residential palace but as a religious or ceremonial center, potentially connected to Zoroastrian, Buddhist, or early Islamic practices that were all present in various communities scattered across Central Asia during this transitional period, when the region's religious landscape was shifting rapidly under competing influences arriving from Persia, India, and the expanding Islamic caliphates to the west. Under this reading, the incomplete state of the walls might reflect a religious or political transition that rendered the original purpose obsolete before construction could finish. A shift in ruling ideology that left an expensive, half-built monument to a belief system or authority structure that no longer held power by the time anyone might have resumed the work. There is also a peculiar detail that has drawn attention from researchers examining the site's water infrastructure. Evidence of what appears to be a sophisticated system of underground channels and wells, engineered with a level of hydraulic planning that seems disproportionate to a structure that was never actually completed or occupied. Why invest this level of technical sophistication into infrastructure for a building that shows no clear evidence of ever housing the population such systems would typically be designed to support? Some have suggested the water system may have been completed early in the project, specifically to support the enormous workforce needed for construction itself, only for that same workforce to disperse before the rest of the complex could catch up to the ambition of its foundations. Why does a project this vast requiring stone transported across considerable distances and labor organized on an evidently massive scale simply stop with no war, no fire, no clear historical marker explaining the moment work ended? Was Akyrtas a palace whose patron died before he could see it finished, a religious center rendered obsolete by a change in faith, or something else that the incomplete walls have simply never been arranged correctly to reveal? The stones still sit exactly as their builders left them, mid-thought, on a step that has offered no further explanation in the 12 centuries since anyone last touched them. Wind, and almost nothing else. That's the first sensation at al-Rajajil, a stretch of open desert in the Al-Jaf region of northern Saudi Arabia, where more than 50 groupings of standing sandstone pillars rise from flat, sun-bleached ground with no settlement, no oasis, and no obvious reason for anyone to have gathered here at all. The name itself, al-Rajajil, translates roughly to the men, a description that comes from the pillars' arrangement, standing in loose clusters that, from a distance, can resemble a gathering of human figures scattered across the plain. Most of the stones rise between 2 and 3 meters in height, some standing alone, others grouped in configurations of 3 or more, arranged with a spacing that appears deliberate rather than incidental. Archaeological surveys, including work conducted by Saudi and international teams beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, have generally dated the site to the 4th millennium BC, making these pillars roughly contemporary with the earliest dynastic period of Egypt and among the oldest known megalithic structures anywhere on the Arabian Peninsula. Unlike many megalithic sites elsewhere in the world, al-Rajajil has not yielded significant burial remains directly associated with the standing stones themselves, which immediately complicates the most common default assumption applied to ancient stone arrangements, that they primarily served funerary purposes. Some scattered graves have been identified in the surrounding area, but their connection to the pillars, whether contemporary or added considerably later by different unrelated groups passing through the region, remains genuinely unclear. What has drawn the most sustained scholarly interest is the possibility of astronomical alignment. Several researchers have proposed that specific groupings of pillars align with sunrise positions during the equinoxes, suggesting the site may have functioned as a means of tracking seasonal changes with real precision, a use consistent with other early astronomical megalithic sites found across different parts of the ancient world during roughly similar periods. If accurate, this would mean the people responsible for al-Rajajil possessed both the sustained motivation and the accumulated observational knowledge to mark celestial events architecturally, a level of organized, long-term skywatching that doesn't obviously align with what is otherwise known about the mobile, pastoral communities generally believed to have inhabited this arid region during the 4th millennium BC. This is where the mystery deepens rather than resolves. The Arabian Peninsula during this period is not typically associated with large, settled populations capable of the kind of coordinated, sustained labor that quarrying, transporting, and precisely positioning dozens of substantial stone pillars would require. Most archaeological evidence from this era and region points towards smaller pastoral and semi-nomadic groups, moving seasonally in search of grazing land and water. A lifestyle that doesn't obviously produce the kind of stable, long-term community organization usually required for monumental construction projects elsewhere in the ancient world. So, how and why did a population that seems to have been more mobile than settled commit to a project of this scale, in a location without an obvious water source or defensible strategic value nearby? Some archaeologists have proposed that al-Rajajil may have served as a ceremonial gathering point precisely because of its neutrality, a place belonging to no single settled community, where dispersed groups could convene periodically for shared ritual or seasonal observance without the site being claimed as any one group's permanent territory. Under this reading, the very absence of a nearby settlement isn't a puzzle to be explained away, but potentially the entire point, a deliberately chosen neutral ground where astronomical observation and communal ritual could occur outside the normal territorial boundaries that governed everyday pastoral life. Others take a more cautious view, noting that our understanding of Arabian prehistory during this period remains considerably less complete than for better excavated regions like the Fertile Crescent or the Nile Valley, and that al-Rajajil may simply reflect social complexity in 4th millennium Arabia that current archaeological evidence has not yet fully documented elsewhere. Under this interpretation, the site isn't necessarily anomalous so much as a rare, surviving indicator of an organizational capacity that existed more broadly across the region, but left few other visible traces for archaeologists to find and study. There is also the matter of erosion and weathering patterns on the stones themselves, which some researchers have used to argue for possible construction phases, separated by considerable time, suggesting the site may not have been built in a single coordinated effort at all, but gradually added to over generations by different groups who each contributed pillars to an existing arrangement, whose original purpose they may only partially have understood or continued to honor. What drew people repeatedly to this exact, otherwise unremarkable, stretch of desert, generation after generation, if that is indeed what happened? Was al-Rajajil a calendar, a boundary marker, a gathering place for people who belonged to no fixed territory, or some combination that shifted meaning as different groups added their own stones across centuries? The wind that moves across this plain today is the only witness that has been present continuously since the first pillar was set upright, and it has kept whatever it once knew entirely to itself. Desert wind gives way to river mist. On the island of Bali, in a steep valley near the village of Tampaxiring, the Pakarisan River cuts through solid rock, and carved directly into the cliff faces on either side of it stand 10 monumental shrines, each one cut not as a separate structure but sculpted out of the living stone of the valley itself. Gunung Kawi, meaning roughly Mountain of the Poets or Mountain of the Pen, consists of nashes carved into the rock face resembling candy, the temple shrine towers common to Hindu-Buddhist architecture across ancient Java and Bali. Each shrine reaches roughly 7 meters in height, carved in relief so precise that from the front they appear to be freestanding temple towers, when in fact they are inseparable from the cliff behind them, hollowed out and shaped entirely from the mountainside. Inscriptions carved near several of the shrines have allowed archaeologists to date the complex with more confidence than many megalithic sites elsewhere, placing its construction in the 11th century AD during the reign of King Anak Wungsu, a ruler of the Warmadewa dynasty that controlled Bali during this period. The most widely accepted mainstream interpretation holds that the shrines were built as memorials, likely dedicated to King Udayana, Anak Wungsu's father, along with various royal wives and consorts, functioning as a kind of ancestral commemoration carved permanently into the landscape itself rather than built from portable, perishable materials that might not endure. This explanation fits comfortably within broader patterns of ancestor veneration common to the region during this period, and the inscriptions found near the site lend it genuine scholarly credibility. And yet, the deeper one looks into the specifics, the more the confidence of that explanation begins to soften at the edges. The precise identity of each shrine, meaning exactly which historical figure each individual niche was meant to honor, remains a matter of ongoing scholarly debate rather than settled certainty. Some researchers assign specific shrines to specific queens based on comparative size and positioning, reasoning that a larger or more central niche likely honored a principal wife rather than a lesser consort. But this remains an interpretation built from architectural logic rather than any inscription that explicitly names each individual shrine's intended occupant. There is also the puzzle of why this particular technique, carving monuments directly from bedrock rather than constructing them from separately quarried and assembled stone, was chosen at all. Structural temple architecture using cut and assembled stone was already well established in the wider Hindu-Buddhist architectural tradition, influencing Bali at this time, seen in contemporary structures elsewhere in the archipelago. Choosing instead to carve directly into a living cliff face, a technique demanding extraordinary precision and offering no room for correction. Once cutting began, suggests a deliberate symbolic choice rather than simply a practical one. Some scholars have proposed that carving memorials directly from the mountain itself, rather than building them from separate materials, was intended to symbolically bind the honored royal ancestors permanently to the land they had ruled, an act of literal, physical integration between dynasty and territory that a freestanding structure could never quite achieve in the same way. Local folklore offers its own, considerably more fantastical explanation, attributing the entire complex to a single legendary figure, Kebo Iwa, a giant of immense strength said to have carved the shrines using only his fingernails in a single night. While no serious archaeologist treats this account as literal history, its persistence across generations reflects something genuine about how thoroughly the technical difficulty of the site impressed the people who lived among it for centuries afterward. Unable to otherwise account for how such precise, monumental carving could have been achieved with the tools available during the period of its construction. Beyond the main river valley shrines, a separate, more secluded cluster exists further into the surrounding hillside, accessible only by crossing the river and climbing through rice terraces, adding a monastic complex of caves and additional carved niches whose specific function remains even less securely established than the main royal memorials, with some researchers proposing these more remote structures may have housed monks or ascetics associated with the royal court's religious practices, living in deliberate isolation alongside the memorials they were perhaps tasked with maintaining. What makes Gunung Kawi a genuinely distinct kind of puzzle is that unlike sites where uncertainty stems from a total absence of written record, here inscriptions do survive. Dates are reasonably secure, and a named king anchors the entire complex to a specific historical moment. And still, the granular questions, exactly who each shrine commemorates, why bedrock carving was chosen over structural building, what specific rituals took place in the secluded monastic caves across the river, remain genuinely open, debated among specialists who have far more evidence here than at many other sites, and still cannot fully agree on the answers. Did Anak Wongsu commission this valley as a literal, physical binding of his family's memory to the land itself? A statement meant to outlast any building that could crumble or burn? Or does the true purpose behind carving directly into a living mountain remain something the surviving inscriptions only gesture toward, without ever quite completing the explanation? The river still runs between the shrines exactly as it has for 9 centuries, carrying the same mist past faces carved into rock that has never once answered back. A river that never answered back closed the last chapter, and the same stubborn silence surrounds a very different kind of stone 8,000 kilometers west, in the dry scrubland of central Mali, where dozens of cylindrical pillars lie scattered across the ground rather than standing upright, as though something interrupted their purpose before it could be completed, or after it already had. Tondidaru sits near the town of Niafunke, in the lakes region along the Niger River's inland delta, and consists of more than 100 megalithic stones, most carved from laterite, a reddish, iron-rich rock common to the region. Some of the pillars are simple, tapered cylinders, but a number of them display a distinctive and unusual feature: a mushroom-like cap or bulbous protrusion at one end, a shape that appears deliberately carved rather than naturally occurring, and one that has no clear parallel among the megalithic traditions of neighboring regions in West Africa. Archaeological dating of the site, based on associated material and stratigraphy, places the monuments broadly within the 1st millennium BC through the early 1st millennium AD, though the wide range itself reflects how difficult this site has been to pin down with real precision. What strikes most visitors and researchers alike is that the majority of these stones are found lying on their sides rather than standing, scattered in a manner that initially suggested to earlier researchers a site toppled by deliberate destruction, perhaps through conquest, religious upheaval, or some other disruptive event. More recent archaeological assessment has complicated this reading considerably, with some researchers now questioning whether many of these stones were ever intended to stand upright at all, given that a number of them show no clear base designed for stable vertical positioning, raising the possibility that their current, recumbent arrangement may be closer to their original placement than earlier interpretations assumed. This uncertainty about basic orientation, whether these monuments were meant to stand as pillars or lie as markers, is only the beginning of the site's unresolved questions. The function of Tondidaru itself remains genuinely contested. Early 20th century French colonial researchers, who conducted some of the first documented investigations of the site, proposed a funerary interpretation, suggesting the megaliths marked burial locations for an ancient population whose specific cultural identity remains unknown, since no clear continuity has been firmly established between the builders of Tondidaru and any of the ethnic groups presently inhabiting the region. Excavations have identified some burial remains in proximity to certain stones, lending this theory reasonable support. Yet the relationship between specific pillars and specific burials has never been established with the kind of one-to-one clarity that would settle the question definitively. The distinctive mushroom-capped shape carved into a significant portion of the stones has generated its own persistent speculation. Some researchers have proposed a phallic symbolic interpretation, tied to fertility rites or ancestor veneration practices with parallels documented in other regional traditions across sub-Saharan Africa, where similar iconography appears in different contexts and different periods. Others have suggested the cap shape might represent a stylized human or ancestral figure, an abstracted head atop a body-like shaft. Though this reading remains speculative, without inscriptions or other corroborating evidence to confirm what the original carvers actually intended by the distinctive form. Compounding these uncertainties is the frustratingly thin state of the broader archaeological record for this specific culture and period in this exact part of Mali. Unlike better documented ancient West African polities, such as the later Mali and Songhai empires, the community or communities responsible for Tondidaru left behind no surviving written record, no clearly identified settlement directly adjacent to the megaliths that would allow archaeologists to connect builders to monument with real confidence, and no oral tradition among modern local populations that reliably traces its lineage back to the people who actually carved and placed these stones. The connection between the monument and its builders has effectively been severed by time, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct intent and function almost entirely from the stones themselves, without the benefit of a living cultural thread linking back to explain them. Some researchers have also raised the possibility that Tondagaru represents not a single, unified building phase, but an accumulation of monuments added across a considerable span of centuries by different groups, each contributing their own stones to a location that had already accrued some form of sacred or communal significance before they arrived, similar to patterns proposed at other ancient megalithic sites where continuous, layered use gradually obscures a single original purpose beneath centuries of reuse and reinterpretation. Why does a monument field this large, this labor-intensive, and this symbolically distinctive have no surviving story attached to it? Not even a fragmentary local memory reaching back to explain what these stones were for. Were the mushroom-capped pillars ancestral markers, fertility symbols, grave markers, or something with a meaning entirely outside categories? Modern archaeology is equipped to recognize the stones remain scattered across the scrubland precisely as generations of researchers have found them, red laterite catching the same sun that has watched over them for 2,000 years, offering nothing further than their own carved shapes and their obstinate refusal to lie in any pattern that resolves the question of what they were always meant to do. Red laterite gives way to red earth of a different kind. Some 4,000 kilometers southeast of Mali's scattered pillars, in the rolling grasslands of western Uganda near Ntusi, the ground itself has been carved into the monument rather than stone quarried and shaped by hand. A sprawling network of ditches and earthen banks stretching across roughly 10 square kilometers, so extensive that early European explorers who encountered it in the late 19th century struggled to believe local communities alone could have built it. Bigo Bia Mugenyi, meaning roughly the fortress of Mugenyi, consists of an estimated 10 kilometers of ditches, some cut more than 5 meters deep and 10 meters wide, along with earthen ramparts forming a complex, irregular system of enclosures rather than a single simple perimeter. Archaeological dating, based largely on radiocarbon analysis of material recovered from excavations conducted in the mid-20th century and refined by later research, places the main construction phases somewhere between the 13th and 16th centuries AD, situating Bigo within the broader Chwezi period, associated in regional oral tradition with the semi-legendary Chwezi dynasty, said to have ruled over an early state predating the Bunyoro and other Great Lakes kingdoms that followed. The scale of the earthworks is where the mainstream picture starts to strain against easy explanation. Moving this volume of earth, by conservative estimates requiring the removal of hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of soil using only hand tools, implies an organized labor force sustained over considerable time, coordinated by some form of centralized authority, capable of directing that labor toward a shared project, rather than leaving it to individual household initiative. This level of coordination is consistent with early state formation, and many archaeologists interpret Bigo as evidence of exactly that. One of the earliest identifiable centers of organized political power in the interlacustrine region of East Africa. A capital or ceremonial center for a ruling elite whose authority extended across a considerably wider territory than the site itself. Yet, the specific purpose of the earthworks resists easy categorization. Unlike a conventional fortification, the ditch system at Bigo doesn't form a single continuous defensive perimeter in the way a besieged medieval European town's walls might. Instead, it comprises multiple linked enclosures of varying sizes, some seemingly designed to corral or contain cattle rather than repel human attackers, a detail that has led many researchers to favor an interpretation centered on cattle keeping and pastoral wealth, rather than military defense as the primary organizing logic behind the site's layout. Cattle, in the oral traditions and later kingdoms of this region, represented the single most important marker of wealth and political power, and a site designed primarily to manage, protect, and display enormous herds would align closely with what later Great Lakes kingdoms are independently known to have valued most. This raises a genuinely difficult question that current archaeology has not fully settled. Was Bigo primarily a defensive stronghold, a royal capital, a ceremonial center, or an enormous, elaborately engineered cattle enclosure whose scale simply reflected the political importance of livestock wealth in a society organized fundamentally around herding, rather than agriculture or warfare? The physical evidence supports elements of all these readings simultaneously, without decisively confirming any single one as the site's dominant original purpose. Oral tradition offers its own answer, though one that blends historical memory with legend in ways difficult to fully disentangle. The Chwezi are remembered across multiple Great Lakes kingdoms, not simply as historical rulers but as semi-divine figures, credited with supernatural abilities, and eventually said to have mysteriously vanished from the region entirely, their disappearance marking the end of the Chwezi era and the beginning of successor dynasties, including the Bito dynasty that came to rule Bunyoro. Whether the Chwezi represent a genuine historical polity, remembered through generations of oral transmission, a later mythologized memory of several distinct groups conflated into a single legendary dynasty, or some blend of both, remains a matter of ongoing debate among historians who specialize in the region's oral traditions, since no contemporary written record from the period itself survives to corroborate the specifics independently. Compounding the difficulty is the fact that Bigo was not occupied continuously. Archaeological evidence suggests phases of use followed by periods of abandonment, and the earthworks show no clear evidence of the kind of dense, permanent residential occupation one might expect from a long-standing royal capital, raising the possibility that the site functioned periodically, perhaps as a seasonal gathering point tied to specific ceremonial or political occasions rather than a continuously inhabited administrative center. Why would a society capable of this scale of coordinated earth-moving leave behind so little corroborating detail about the specific rulers, events, and daily life that once filled these enclosures? Was Bigo the seat of a genuine historical Chwezi state, whose memory later generations wrapped in supernatural legend precisely because its real scale defied ordinary explanation? Or does the truth sit somewhere more modest, in a shifting confederation of pastoral communities whose combined labor simply left a footprint too large for later oral tradition to describe in anything but mythic terms? The ditches remain cut into the Ugandan grassland exactly as their builders left them, holding rainwater after every wet season the way they likely always did, still waiting for the rest of their story to surface. Centuries before cattle enclosures were cut into the grasslands of Uganda, and roughly 2,500 years earlier than that, in the arid scrubland of northwestern Kenya near Lake Turkana, a different kind of engineering was already underway, one aimed not at herding livestock, but at tracking the sky itself. Namoratunga consists of two related but distinct sites near the shores of Lake Turkana, the more famous of which, Namoratunga the Saint, comprises 19 basalt pillars arranged in a specific, non-random pattern, driven upright into the ground near the village of Qal'at. Local Turkana communities gave the site its name, meaning roughly stone people, reflecting the pillars' loose resemblance to standing human figures scattered across the landscape. Archaeological work at the site, most notably research conducted by American archaeoastronomer B.M. Lynch alongside Kenyan archaeologist L.H. Robbins in the 1970s, produced radiocarbon dates placing construction at approximately 300 BC, making Namoratunga significantly older than many other African megalithic sites and placing it among the oldest known astronomically aligned monuments on the continent. The claim that first brought Namoratunga international attention, and that remains the site's most debated feature, is its proposed connection to a sophisticated calendar system. Lynch and Robbins argued that the alignment of specific pillars corresponds closely with the rising positions of particular stars and constellations, including Triangulum, the Pleiades, Bellatrix, and Aldebaran, in a configuration that, if intentional, would allow observers to track a calendar closely resembling the traditional lunar stellar system still used today by the Cushitic-speaking Borana people of southern Ethiopia and northern Kenya, a calendar that regulates a 12-month lunar cycle synchronized with specific stellar risings. If this interpretation holds, Namoratunga would represent physical evidence that a sophisticated, astronomically precise calendar system, one still practiced by pastoralist communities in the region today, has roots extending back some 23 centuries, considerably earlier than most conventional narratives of East African scientific and astronomical achievement have generally assumed. This is precisely why the claim has generated such sustained scholarly interest and, in equal measure, such sustained scholarly caution. Critics of the original interpretation have raised several serious methodological concerns. Some astronomers and archaeologists who have revisited the site's alignments argue that with 19 pillars available for potential pairing and matching against dozens of visible stars, the statistical probability of finding some coincidental alignments that appear meaningful, without those alignments reflecting genuine ancient intent, increases substantially. Precession, the slow shift in the apparent position of stars relative to Earth over long time spans, further complicates matters, since a stellar alignment that appears significant when calculated against modern star positions may not have aligned with the same stars, or aligned as precisely when the pillars were originally placed 23 centuries ago. Reassessments of the original data have produced mixed results, with some researchers affirming that at least several of the alignments remain statistically compelling, even after accounting for these concerns, while others maintain that the evidence, while suggestive, falls short of the kind of rigorous confirmation that would settle the debate definitively. This tension between a genuinely tantalizing possibility and the legitimate scientific caution required before accepting it as established fact is precisely where Namoratunga's mystery actually lives. It isn't a case of total archaeological silence, the way sites without any surviving cultural descendants often are. Here, a living pastoralist tradition, the Borana calendar system, still exists today, still functions as living practice rather than reconstructed guesswork, and the tantalizing possibility remains open that this specific stone site represents its most ancient material anchor point. But the connection between the ancient stones and the modern calendar remains an inference, however well-reasoned, rather than a documented, unbroken chain of transmission that historians can trace with full confidence across 23 centuries of intervening time. There's also the matter of the second, less studied site nearby, Namoratunga the Firs, which contains a cemetery with carved stone markers of a different character entirely, some bearing what appear to be intentional engravings, adding a funerary dimension to the location that sits alongside and only partially explained in relation to the astronomically aligned pillars at the second site a short distance away. Whether these two nearby sites reflect a single coherent tradition serving multiple purposes, astronomical and funerary combined, or two related but functionally distinct uses of a shared sacred landscape by communities separated by considerable time, remains an open question that further excavation has not yet fully resolved. Did the pastoralist communities who once gathered here 23 centuries ago genuinely encode a working calendar into these basalt pillars, one whose living echo still governs ceremonies and seasonal decisions among Cushitic-speaking peoples today? Or does the desire to find that continuity, understandable and appealing as it is, risk reading more precision into scattered stones than their original builders ever intended? The pillars still stand near Turkana's shores, exactly where they were driven into the ground so long ago, and the stars they may or may not have been built to track continue rising above them on schedule, indifferent to which explanation eventually proves correct. Stones that never answered back closed the last chapter. But on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, in a river valley near the village of Solicaro, a different set of stones seem, at first glance, to be trying to answer something anyway. Carved faces stare out from megalithic pillars scattered across a hillside, weapons etched into their stone bodies, and no one has ever fully agreed on who they were meant to represent, or why they were eventually torn down and repurposed by the very people who may have once carved them. Filitosa is the most extensive and best-preserved site in a wider Corsican tradition of statue menhirs, anthropomorphic standing stones carved with increasing detail over the course of the region's prehistory. The earliest phases of activity at the site date back to the Neolithic, but the monuments that draw the most attention today, the statue menhirs themselves, belong primarily to the Bronze Age, roughly 1500 BC, a period local archaeologists associate with the Taurian culture, named for the Tauri, or tower-like stone structures, that this group built across southern Corsica during this era. What makes the statue menhirs at Filitosa so immediately striking is their specificity. Unlike simpler standing stones found across much of prehistoric Europe, several of the Filitosa menhirs feature carved human faces, complete with distinct facial features, and some display carved representations of swords, daggers, and other weaponry etched directly into the stone, suggesting these were not abstract markers, but deliberate representations of specific warriors or warrior ancestors, rendered with enough individualized detail that some archaeologists have proposed each statue may have commemorated a particular historical figure, rather than serving as a generic symbolic type. This alone would make Filitosa a significant prehistoric site. What makes it a genuine mystery is what happened to several of these statues after they were carved. Excavations conducted primarily under French archaeologist Roger Grosjean, beginning in the 1940s and continuing through subsequent decades, revealed that a number of the original statue menhirs had been deliberately taken down, broken, and incorporated as ordinary building material into the walls of later stone towers constructed at the same site, apparently by the descendants, or at least the successors, of the very culture that had originally carved and erected them as commemorative monuments. Why would a society tear down carved representations of what appear to have been honored warriors or ancestors, and use the broken pieces as mere construction rubble for entirely different structures? Grosjean's own interpretation, which remains influential though not universally accepted, proposed that Filitosa's later Taurian inhabitants may have been a distinct, possibly invading population, one that displaced or conquered the earlier statue-carving culture, and then deliberately dismantled their monuments as an act of conquest, converting sacred commemorative objects into ordinary building stone as a pointed statement of dominance over a defeated people whose ancestors those statues had originally honored. This invasion theory has faced considerable pushback in subsequent decades, as later archaeological reassessment has questioned whether the evidence genuinely supports a distinct invading population versus an internal cultural or political shift within the same broad community, one where changing religious or social priorities, rather than outright conquest, led later generations to repurpose monuments their own ancestors had built. no longer holding the same reverence for objects that previous generations had once considered sacred. Under this reading, the destruction reflects internal transformation rather than external violence, a society reorganizing its own relationship to its past rather than a new population erasing someone else's. The specific identities the carved faces were meant to represent remain entirely unrecoverable. No inscriptions accompany any of the statues. No written tradition survives from the Torayan culture to clarify whether these figures depicted specific named warriors, generalized ancestral archetypes, defeated enemies memorialized as trophies, or protective guardian spirits meant to ward off some perceived threat. The weapons carved into several statues have led some researchers to wonder whether certain menhirs might represent defeated rivals rather than honored ancestors, a display of conquered enemies rather than a memorial to one's own dead. Though this interpretation remains speculative, resting on the same ambiguous visual evidence available to every other competing theory. There is also the broader question of what relationship, if any, connects Philotosa's Taurian culture to the mysterious sea peoples referenced in ancient Egyptian records from roughly the same general period, a connection some researchers have proposed based on superficial similarities in weaponry depicted at Philotosa and in Egyptian reliefs, though this remains one of the more speculative threads in the site's scholarship, lacking the kind of direct archaeological link that would move it from intriguing possibility to established fact. Were the carved faces at Philotosa meant to honor the dead, intimidate the living, or mark a victory over people whose names have not survived in any form? And what does it mean that the very culture responsible for carving them apparently lost enough reverence for their meaning, within a few centuries, to break them apart and stack them into walls meant for entirely different purposes? The broken statue fragments remain visible today, built directly into the stone towers that replaced them. Faces still partially recognizable within walls their own carvers' descendants built over them, saying nothing further about who they once were meant to be. Broken faces built into walls give way now to a field of intact structures, thousands of them, scattered across the basalt plateau of the Golan Heights, not far from Rujm el-Hiri's concentric rings, near a spot known today as Shamir. Here, in one of the densest concentrations of dolmens found anywhere in the Levant, an estimated several hundred to over 1,000 stone burial structures sit clustered across the landscape, some still capped by their massive covering stones, forming what researchers have come to call one of the largest dolmen fields in the entire Middle East. Each dolmen follows a broadly similar design: 2 or more large upright basalt slabs supporting a single massive capstone, creating an enclosed chamber originally intended, most archaeologists agree, for burial. Excavations conducted at Shamir and across the wider Golan dolmen fields, including significant work led by Israeli archaeologist Uri Berger and colleagues in more recent years, have generally dated the bulk of construction to the Intermediate Bronze Age, roughly 2900 to 2300 BC, though some dolmens in the broader region show evidence of continued or renewed use extending into later periods, including secondary burials added centuries after a structure's initial construction. The basic funerary function of these structures is not seriously disputed. What has kept researchers debating for decades are the questions surrounding who built them, in what social context, and why this specific stretch of the Golan Heights contains such an extraordinarily dense concentration of these monuments compared to surrounding regions, where dolmens exist but in far smaller numbers. The scale itself is the first puzzle. Constructing even a single dolmen required moving and positioning basalt slabs weighing multiple tons using only the technology available during the Intermediate Bronze Age, a period generally associated with smaller, more dispersed pastoral and semi-nomadic populations rather than large, centralized settlements with the kind of organized labor forces typically required for monumental construction. Yet, Shamir alone contains hundreds of these structures, clustered closely enough together that the sheer cumulative labor invested across the entire field implies either a substantially larger and more socially organized population than the conventional picture of this period and region generally suggests, or construction spread out gradually across many generations, with different family or kinship groups contributing structures over a span of centuries rather than all at once. Recent research has added a further layer of complexity that has genuinely shifted scholarly thinking on the matter. A 2021 study using cosmogenic isotope dating, examining exposure ages of the basalt boulders that dolmen builders would have needed to select and move, suggested that some of the raw stone material at certain Golan dolmen sites may have been exposed and available considerably earlier than the burials themselves, opening questions about whether the stones were sourced from natural boulder fields already scattered across the landscape, selected specifically for their size and shape, or whether some other, more deliberate quarrying process was involved that current dating methods have not yet fully clarified. There is also the matter of the surrounding landscape itself, since unlike some megalithic traditions found in fertile, densely populated valleys, Shamir sits in territory not otherwise well suited to intensive settlement, given the water and soil conditions of the period, raising the recurring question found at several sites already examined in this exploration. Why did a population without an obvious large permanent settlement nearby commit such enormous, sustained labor to a location that offered little practical advantage beyond whatever significance the dolmen field itself held for the people who built it? Some archaeologists have proposed that Shamir and the wider Golan dolmen fields functioned as a form of territorial marking, a means for dispersed pastoral groups moving seasonally across the plateau to establish and reaffirm ancestral claims to specific grazing and water resources through the visible, permanent presence of buried kin, a practice documented in other pastoral societies where burial monuments serve simultaneously as memorials and as physical assertions of a group's long-term connection to contested land. Others emphasize a more directly religious or cosmological interpretation, noting that certain dolmen fields in the region show alignments that some researchers have connected to solstice sunrise positions, echoing the same astronomical themes found at nearby Rujm el-Hiri, though these proposed alignments remain less thoroughly documented and more contested than the more famous rings a short distance away. What deepens the mystery further is the near-total absence of any surviving cultural or textual tradition connecting the builders of these dolmens to any later, better documented society in the region. The people responsible for Shamir left no writing, and no clear cultural through-line links them definitively to the various peoples who would later inhabit the Golan across the subsequent millennia, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct social organization, belief, and intent almost entirely from the stones themselves and the scattered remains found within a relative handful of excavated chambers. Why does this specific plateau hold one of the densest concentrations of megalithic burial architecture anywhere in the ancient Near East, built by a population whose social structure seems, on paper, less equipped for monumental construction than the achievement itself implies? Was Shamir a sacred ancestral landscape reaffirmed generation after generation, a territorial claim written permanently into stone rather than any perishable record, or something closer to both at once? The dolmens remain exactly where their builders left them, capstones still balanced after more than 4,000 years, guarding chambers that have given up their bones far more readily than they have given up their reasons. Some miles west of that last desert threshold, where the story we've just left still lingers in the dust, the land begins to change. The dry plateaus give way to a great scar in the earth. The Jordan Valley, cut deep by ancient waters, its slopes terraced with basalt boulders dark as burnt bread. Here, on a hill overlooking the valley floor, sits a place that predates almost everything else we have discussed tonight. Its name is Jebel al-Mutawwaq, and it may be one of the oldest deliberately built sanctuaries on the face of the earth. The site rises modestly, unassumingly, from the surrounding hills near the Jordanian city of Zarqa. To an untrained eye, it might look like nothing more than a scattering of stones, but archaeologists who have walked this ground since the early 2000s know better. Beneath the surface lies a settlement dating back roughly 7,000 years to the Chalcolithic period, the age when humanity first began to work with copper, when villages were still finding their shape, and when the rituals that would define entire civilizations were only beginning to take form. At the heart of the site stands what researchers have called a sanctuary, a walled enclosure, oval in shape, built with careful intention. Inside it, 3 standing stones were discovered, arranged with what appears to be deliberate alignment. 2 of them, according to the excavation team led by Spanish archaeologist Juan José Ibáñez, seem oriented toward the rising sun at the winter solstice. The 3rd stone's purpose remains less clear. Was it symbolic? Was it functional, marking a boundary between the sacred and the ordinary? Or did it serve some purpose we no longer have the language to name? What makes Jebel al-Mutawwaq more than a curious ruin is what surrounds the sanctuary itself. Just beyond its walls, archaeologists uncovered a cluster of dolmens, megalithic tomb structures made of massive stone slabs, some weighing several tons. Dolmens are found scattered across the Levant, but rarely have they been found in such close and clear relationship to a settlement and a ceremonial structure. Here, the living, the dead, and whatever gods or forces the builders believed governed, both seem to have existed within a single, carefully choreographed landscape. Consider the effort this required. To move stones of this size using only Chalcolithic tools, no wheel, no draft animals harnessed for such labor, no metal levers strong enough to bear the load, demanded organized human effort on a scale we don't usually associate with communities this early and this small. Historians estimate the population of the settlement itself may have numbered only in the low hundreds. And yet, they built monuments that would still be standing, still provoking questions 7,000 years later. Why here? That is the question that has followed researchers since the first survey of the hill. The sanctuary does not sit beside the richest farmland, nor does it guard an obvious trade route. Its builders seem to have chosen the location for a different kind of value, one tied to sightlines, to the horizon, to the specific angle at which the sun climbs over the valley on the shortest day of the year. This was not agriculture, this was astronomy, or something adjacent to it. An attempt, perhaps the earliest attempt in this region, to fix a human structure to the rhythm of the sky. Some archaeologists describe Jebel al-Mutawwaq as evidence of an early, structured belief system. Perhaps ancestor worship, perhaps a solar cult, perhaps something bound to fertility and the turning of seasons that farming communities depended on. The dolmens, positioned so near the sanctuary, suggest a worldview in which the dead were not separated from the living but rather kept close, watched over, perhaps even consulted. Grave goods found within some of the tombs, modest pottery, tools, ornamental beads, hint at ritual practices we can only partially reconstruct. But there are other voices in this conversation, ones that exist further from the mainstream. Some researchers and independent writers have pointed to the sheer sophistication of the solstice alignment and asked whether such precise astronomical knowledge should really belong to a community this size, this early, with no written language and no metal tools beyond the most primitive copperwork. Could such alignments have been achieved through generations of patient observation alone? Or does the site hint at forgotten knowledge, transmitted, borrowed, or inherited from a source not yet identified in the archaeological record? Mainstream scholars generally answer that human beings did not need complex technology to observe the sun. They needed only patience, memory, and enough generations to refine what they saw. It is a compelling argument, and yet, standing among those stones, knowing what it must have taken to raise them, one can understand why the imagination reaches further. There is also the matter of what remains unexcavated. Only a portion of Jebel al-Mutawwaq's full extent has been studied in detail. Surveys suggest the settlement may have sprawled considerably further than current excavations reveal, and further dolmens likely still lie beneath centuries of accumulated soil and stone, unopened, unread. What else might the ground still hold? Records of a lost cosmology, evidence of contact with other early societies who shared this obsession with sky and stone, or perhaps nothing more than what has already been found, only more of it, waiting. For now, the sanctuary keeps its silence, its solstice stones still catching the first light of winter mornings the way they may have for 7,000 years. The people who built it left no names, no words, only their careful geometry pressed into the land. And so the hill above the Jordan Valley remains what it has always been, a place where the living once tried to speak with something larger than themselves, in a language whose full meaning we have not yet learned to read. Wind moves across sand the way it once moved across basalt, a low, constant hiss, scouring stone, scouring dune, indifferent to what it uncovers or buries. That same wind carries us now, away from the dolmen fields of the Golan, southeast across a changing landscape, until the black volcanic rock gives way to something softer, paler, endlessly shifting. The red and gold sands of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, where a site called Mleiha waits beneath the dunes. There is little here to announce itself from a distance, no towering capstones, no concentric rings visible from above. Mleiha reveals itself slowly, in low mud brick walls half reclaimed by sand, in the quiet contours of ancient terraces, in a silence broken only by wind and the occasional call of a bird crossing the empty interior. And yet, beneath this unassuming surface lies one of the most archaeologically significant and quietly perplexing sites in southeastern Arabia. Mleiha sits roughly 40 kilometers from the Gulf Coast, in terrain that today seems to offer little reason for sustained habitation. Yet archaeologists have documented human presence here stretching back more than 130,000 years, making it one of the oldest known sites of human activity outside Africa. Stone tools recovered from its ancient terraces point to a time when Arabia's climate was far wetter than it is now. A green corridor briefly opened before the desert reclaimed it. Early humans passed through, or lingered, in a landscape that would later transform entirely, and transform again. The site's most intensively studied chapter, however, belongs to a much later period. During the Iron Age, and into the centuries before and after the turn of the millennium, Mleiha became the capital of a regional kingdom controlling trade routes that connected Arabia's interior to the wider ancient world. Excavations led over several decades by French and Emirati archaeological teams, working under the Sharjah Directorate of Antiquities, have revealed a fortified settlement, monumental tombs, a fortress with rounded defensive towers, and a striking burial complex containing horses and camels interred alongside their owner. That burial, dated to roughly the 1st century BC, belonged to a man laid to rest with elaborate bronze and iron equipment, his animals sacrificed and buried beside him. It speaks unmistakably to rank, to a warrior or ruling figure whose status extended even into the arrangements of his death. Nearby, the fortress with its thick mud brick walls suggests a settlement that anticipated conflict. From where, exactly, remains unresolved. Was Mleiha defending its position in a competitive network of incense and spice routes, watching for rivals who might seize control of that lucrative trade? Or did the threat come from closer, more local rivalries, woven through the shifting tribal alliances of ancient Arabia? What sharpens the mystery further is what happened afterward. Sometime in the early centuries AD, Mleiha's prominence begins to fade. Monumental construction slows, then stops. The mainstream explanation points to changing trade patterns, perhaps new routes emerging as Roman and Mediterranean demand for southern Arabian incense shifted, redirecting the wealth that had sustained the kingdom. It is a credible, well-supported account. And yet the manner of Mleiha's decline, gradual, largely peaceful, without the scars of violent conquest, has left some researchers considering other possibilities. Environmental strain in a landscape already balanced precariously on scarce water, or a political unraveling, too gradual and too quiet to leave behind the kind of evidence archaeology typically depends on. And then there is the older mystery, buried far deeper in time. The Paleolithic terraces and flint scatters that first drew researchers to Mleiha in the 1990s raise a question that extends well beyond the site itself. If Mleiha truly represents one of the earliest waypoints for humans moving out of Africa into Asia, does that mean Arabia's role in the human story has been underestimated, overshadowed by the more thoroughly mapped corridors through the Levant? Could this quiet stretch of desert hold evidence of migrations more complex, more sustained, than current models fully account for? It is a question that remains genuinely open, resting somewhere between established fact and possibility still waiting to be tested. Standing among Mleiha's low walls today, where fortress and tomb and Paleolithic terrace all occupy the same patient stretch of sand, it is hard not to sense the accumulated weight of so much time folded into one place. A kingdom rose here, in land that demanded constant negotiation with scarcity, and then it faded, almost soundlessly, leaving behind more questions than answers. Long before that kingdom existed at all, something else drew humans to this same ground, again and again, across tens of thousands of years. What was it about this quiet corner of Arabia that kept calling people back, across so vast a stretch of time? And what, still resting beneath these dunes, might yet answer that question? That same question: what threat could justify walls, weapons, warriors buried in state, follows us now across an ocean and a continent, to a valley on the northern coast of Peru, where the answer, if there is one, was carved directly into stone. Here, in the Chasma Valley, rises a temple complex known as Cerro Sechín, and unlike the quiet mud brick ambiguity of Arabia's fortress walls, this site does not whisper its violence. It displays it in unflinching detail on more than 400 carved stone monoliths that have troubled and fascinated researchers for nearly a century. Cerro Sechín dates to approximately 1600 BC, placing it among the oldest monumental stone structures in the Americas, predating the rise of the Inca by well over 3,000 years. The site consists of a rectangular temple platform faced with a retaining wall built from large granite slabs, and it is this wall that has made Cerro Sechín famous and troubling in equal measure. Carved into the stone is a procession of human figures. Warriors, armed and standing in formation, march alongside what can only be described as victims. Bodies split open, organs exposed, severed heads arranged in careful rows, disembodied eyes and vertebrae rendered with an anatomical precision that seems almost clinical for a culture working 3,500 years before modern medicine understood human anatomy in comparable detail. Archaeologists generally agree that Cerro Sechín predates the later, better-known civilizations of Peru and belongs instead to a formative period when complex societies along the Peruvian coast were first organizing themselves around monumental religious architecture. The mainstream interpretation holds that the carvings commemorate a military victory, perhaps a specific historical battle, its outcome preserved in stone as a warning, a boast, or a ritual reenactment meant to be witnessed by all who approached the temple. Under this reading, the warriors represent a triumphant force, and the mutilated bodies represent the defeated, displayed to reinforce the authority of whatever leadership commissioned the temple's construction. And yet, the sheer anatomical accuracy of the carvings raises a question that mainstream explanation answers less comfortably. How did the artisans of Cerro Sechín come to understand internal human anatomy so precisely, at a time when there is no evidence of a developed medical or dissection tradition in the region? The carvings do not merely suggest violence in a symbolic or stylized way, common in the artistic traditions of many early societies. They depict specific organs, specific structures, rendered with a consistency that has led some researchers to wonder whether the images reflect direct, repeated observation, perhaps drawn from ritual practices involving human sacrifice and the deliberate opening of bodies, practices for which the broader archaeological record at Cerro Sechín offers only partial, indirect support. Excavations at the site have not resolved the question definitively. While human remains have been found in association with the temple, the scale of violence implied by 400 carved figures, some estimates suggesting the imagery could represent hundreds of individual victims, has not been matched by an equivalent quantity of physical skeletal evidence uncovered so far. This gap between the story told in stone and the story told by the ground beneath it has left the interpretation open. Was the temple genuinely built to commemorate a single, real conflict of that scale? Or does it instead represent something more symbolic, an idealized or exaggerated narrative meant to project power rather than record precise historical fact? In the way many ancient societies used monumental art to shape memory rather than simply preserve it. There is also the matter of who built Cerro Sechín in the first place, and why this particular valley became the site of such an early and technically accomplished stone tradition. The broader Chasma Valley would later become home to other major ceremonial centers, but Cerro Sechín's early date places it at the very beginning of that tradition, without a clear predecessor to explain where its builders acquired the skill, the organizational capacity, or the artistic vocabulary needed to produce carvings of this sophistication. Some researchers have proposed cultural exchange with other early Andean centers, ideas and techniques moving along networks of contact not yet fully mapped in the archaeological record. Others have suggested the tradition may have developed largely in isolation, a local response to local pressures, its violent imagery a product of specific historical circumstance, now lost to us entirely. What remains, regardless of interpretation, is the wall itself, still standing on the desert hillside, its warriors still marching, its severed heads still arranged in their same careful rows, exactly as they were left more than 3,500 years ago. Visitors who walk past it today experience something rare in archaeology, a site that does not require reconstruction or imagination to convey its intent. The message, whatever it fully meant to the people who carved it, was built to be unmistakable, built to endure. And yet the fullest meaning of that message still eludes us. Was Cerro Sechín a monument to victory, a warning to enemies, a record of sacrifice woven into the very foundations of a young civilization's identity? Or does it commemorate something else entirely, some event or belief for which we no longer hold the necessary context? The stones remain patient, exact, and silent on the matter, leaving each visitor to wonder what kind of world required a temple built from images like these. Stone that stays silent, layer upon layer, is exactly what waits at our next site. Though here, the silence is not carved into a single wall, but stacked, level upon level, into an artificial hill built by human hands over more than 4,000 years of continuous habitation. This is Qal'at al-Bahrain, a tell rising from the northern coast of Bahrain, its accumulated layers holding one of the most complete and most quietly perplexing sequences of ancient settlement anywhere in the Arabian Gulf. To look at Qal'at al-Bahrain today is to look at a mound roughly 12 meters high, crowned by the visible remains of a Portuguese fort built in the 16th century AD. But that fort is only the final, uppermost chapter of a story that begins far earlier. Buried beneath it in layers, archaeologists have been peeling back since excavations began in the 1950s. Beneath the fort lie the remains of Islamic period settlements, and beneath those, Hellenistic structures from a garrison established after the campaigns of Alexander the Great's successors. And beneath all of that, deeper still, lie the foundations of something older and considerably more mysterious: the ancient civilization known as Dilmun. Dilmun appears in Sumerian texts as a place of extraordinary significance, described in Mesopotamian mythology as a paradise, a land of pure water and eternal life, and referenced repeatedly in cuneiform trade records as a crucial hub connecting Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley civilization. For decades, scholars debated where exactly Dilmun had been located, treating it almost as a semi-mythical place, until archaeological work at Qal'at al-Bahrain and other sites across the island confirmed what many now accept. This unassuming stretch of coastline was very likely the heart of that fabled civilization, flourishing especially between roughly 2200 and 1600 BC. The excavated remains from this Dilmun period reveal a sophisticated trading society. Warehouses, administrative buildings, and evidence of far-reaching commerce, seals bearing distinctive Dilmun iconography that have turned up as far away as the Indus Valley, suggest a civilization that occupied a genuinely pivotal position in the ancient world's earliest long-distance trade networks. Copper from Oman, goods from Mesopotamia, and materials from the Indus all appear to have passed through Bahrain, channeled through the settlement that once stood where this tell now rises. And yet, for all that has been confirmed, Dilmun retains a stubborn, unresolved quality. Why did Mesopotamian texts elevate this particular place, among all the trading partners available to them, to the status of a paradise, a land associated with immortality and the primordial origins of civilization itself? Was this purely poetic elevation, the kind of mythologizing distant, prosperous lands often receive in the literature of cultures who traded with them but never fully understood them? Or did something about Dilmun's actual religious or cultural practice, now lost beneath the layers above it, genuinely earn that reputation among the Mesopotamians who wrote of it? The site offers frustratingly few direct answers. Much of what we know about Dilmun's belief systems comes not from Bahrain itself, but from references embedded in Mesopotamian texts written by outsiders describing a land they revered from a distance. The Dilmun layers at Qal'at al-Bahrain reveal administrative and commercial sophistication in considerable detail, yet the deeper spiritual life of the people who lived there, the reasons a river valley civilization thousands of kilometers away came to regard this island as sacred, remains only partially reconstructed, filtered through myths never meant to serve as archaeology. There is also the broader question of continuity itself. Few sites anywhere in the world show such an unbroken sequence of habitation, spanning Dilmun's Bronze Age prominence through Kassite Assyrian, Hellenistic, Islamic, and finally Portuguese occupation, each civilization building directly atop the last, each apparently drawn to occupy precisely the same patch of coastline for reasons that may have shifted across the centuries but never fully disappeared. What was it about this specific location, modest in size, without dramatic natural defenses, that made it worth returning to, worth building on top of, again and again, for over 4,000 years? Strategic position along Gulf trade routes offers a practical, well-supported answer. But practicality alone does not always explain why a place becomes sacred, why myths accumulate around a stretch of coastline the way sediment accumulates around a tell. Excavations continue at Qal'at al-Bahrain, and UNESCO's recognition of the site as a World Heritage location has ensured its layers will keep being studied, keep being read, level by level, for years to come. But much of what lies within those layers, the fullest picture of Dolmens' religious life, the precise nature of its relationship with the Mesopotamian world that so revered it, remains only partially recovered. Somewhere beneath the visible fort, beneath the Islamic quarters and the Hellenistic garrison, the paradise the Sumerians once wrote of still waits in the soil, its full shape not yet entirely unearthed. What was it, exactly, that a civilization thousands of kilometers away saw in this quiet island? And how much of that vision still lies buried, layer upon undisturbed layer, beneath the ground we can already see? Among the many hands that once moved copper and goods through Dolmens' warehouses were traders from a civilization further east along the Gulf Coast, a Bronze Age culture archaeologists now call an-Nar, named for the small island where its remains were first identified, but whose most striking monuments stand inland, in the oasis region of Al-Ain, at a site known today as el-Hiri Archaeological Park. El-Hiri sits in the eastern reaches of the UAE, near the border with Oman, in a landscape shaped by date palm groves and the quiet persistence of oasis agriculture. At its center rises el-Hiri Grand Tomb, a circular stone structure roughly 12 meters in diameter, its outer wall composed of finely cut limestone blocks fitted together with a precision that has surprised archaeologists studying Bronze Age construction techniques across the wider region. Built around 2500 BC, during the same broad era when Dolmens' trading networks were reaching their height, the tomb belongs to the an-Nar period, a culture whose reach extended across much of what is now the UAE and northern Oman. What immediately distinguishes el-Hiri Grand Tomb from many other Bronze Age burial structures is its decoration. Carved into the entrance stones are depictions of animals, oryx, and what appear to be cattle, rendered in a style that is at once simple and deliberate, alongside human figures whose exact meaning remains debated. Unlike Sechín's unflinching anatomical violence, the imagery at el-Hiri is comparatively gentle, almost pastoral, yet no less puzzling for its restraint. Why choose these particular animals? Why place human figures beside them at the threshold of a tomb meant to house the dead of an entire community, since excavations suggest the structure served not a single individual, but multiple generations, its chambers holding the remains of what may have been hundreds of people interred over an extended period? The scale of communal burial itself raises questions that mainstream archaeology answers only partially. An-Nar society, as reconstructed from el-Hiri and related sites, appears to have organized itself around extended kinship groups, sharing monumental tombs as a means of reinforcing collective identity, and, quite possibly, collective claims to the oasis's most valuable resource, water. el-Hiri's location, fed by underground aquifers, and later by the ingenious phallage irrigation channels that would come to define agriculture across this part of Arabia, suggests a settlement whose survival depended on carefully managed, shared access to a scarce resource. Communal tombs, some researchers argue, may have functioned similarly to the dolmen fields of the Golan, discussed earlier in this exploration, as permanent, visible assertions of a group's enduring right to a specific and valuable stretch of land. Yet Healy complicates any simple explanation. Excavated material from the surrounding settlement reveals evidence of trade connections stretching remarkably far. Pottery fragments and material culture found at Healy show clear affinities with goods from Mesopotamia, from the Indus Valley Civilization, and yes, from Dolmen itself, the very network of exchange explored in the previous chapter of this investigation. This was not an isolated desert community. It was a node, however small, within the same vast web of Bronze Age trade that connected the Gulf to civilizations hundreds and even thousands of kilometers distant. How did a settlement built around a single oasis, with a population likely numbering only in the low thousands at most, sustain and benefit from trade relationships spanning such enormous distances, using only donkey caravans and whatever maritime connections existed along the Gulf Coast? There is also the deeper puzzle of Healy's monumental ambition relative to its apparent size. Constructing a tomb with such precisely cut stonework and maintaining it as a functioning communal burial site across multiple generations implies organizational continuity, shared belief, and sustained labor investment that seem disproportionate to what we might expect from a relatively small oasis settlement operating at the edge of a demanding desert environment. Some researchers have proposed that Healy's builders drew directly on architectural and artistic influences absorbed through their trade contacts with Mesopotamia, adapting foreign ideas about monumental burial into a distinctly local form. Others suggest the opposite, that and-Nar culture developed this sophistication independently, a product of its own internal social evolution, and that its trade connections, while real, tell us less about where its ideas originated than we might assume. Excavations at Healy continue to this day, and the broader and Nar culture it represents remains, in many respects, still only partially understood, its full religious and social framework pieced together from tombs, pottery, and the faint traces left in settlement debris. The carved oryx and cattle at the entrance to Healy Grand Tomb still watch over a threshold whose full meaning was never written down, only built, generation after generation, into stone. What did those animals mean to the people who carved them, standing at the boundary between the living oasis and the dead who sustained its memory? And what more, still resting beneath Al-Ain's palm groves and desert sand, might yet reveal how far this small, resourceful civilization truly reached, and what it believed waited for its people on the far side of that carved threshold. 2,500 years would pass, and a very different threshold would take shape, this time on the other side of the world, carved not into limestone at an oasis, but into a cliff face rising sharply above a lake in the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico. Long before any of this landscape bore the name Chinkultic, the region had already witnessed the rise and fall of earlier Mesoamerican societies. But what remains here, perched above the waters of Lake Tepenkopen, belongs to the classic and terminal classic periods of Maya civilization, roughly AD 300 to 900, a span during which Chinkultic grew into a substantial ceremonial and political center whose full story archaeologists are still working to reconstruct. Chinkultic today presents visitors with an unusual and striking arrangement. The site's structures spread across a series of natural hills and ridges, connected by causeways, their layout dictated as much by the region's dramatic topography as by any predetermined urban plan. At the site's edge, the Acropolis rises above a cenote, one of the striking sinkhole lakes so significant across the Maya world, its steep limestone walls dropping directly into water, whose full depths have never been completely explored. The setting alone lends the site an atmosphere few other Maya centers share, a sense of a city built deliberately at the threshold between solid ground and something deeper, something that plunges beyond what the eye can measure. Among Chinkultic's most significant discoveries is a ball court, one of the largest documented in the Chiapas highlands, along with a series of carved stone monuments, stelae recording dates, rulers, and events in the Maya calendar and hieroglyphic script. One stela in particular, Stela 1, provides one of the clearest dated inscriptions from the site, anchoring Chinkultic's political history within the broader Maya long count calendar and confirming its participation in the sophisticated system of dynastic record-keeping practiced across the wider Maya world during the Classic period. Archaeologists generally view Chinkultic as a regional power, likely maintaining political and trade relationships with larger, more thoroughly documented centers elsewhere in the Maya lowlands. Yet Chinkultic's relative position, geographically removed from the dense concentration of Maya cities further north and east, has left significant portions of its political history less clearly understood than sites like Palenque or Tikal. Why did a center of this scale and sophistication develop in this particular highland setting, somewhat apart from the major Maya population centers, and what precisely was its relationship to those larger, better documented polities? Was Chinkultic a genuinely independent power controlling its own regional network, or did it function more as a satellite, bound through alliance or tribute to more dominant cities whose names appear more frequently in the broader historical record? The inscriptions that survive offer fragments of an answer: dates, titles, occasional references to specific rulers, but the fuller political narrative remains only partially assembled. The cenote itself deepens the site's unresolved character. Across the Maya world, cenotes frequently held profound ritual significance, understood as entrances to the underworld, sites where offerings, and at some locations human remains, were deposited as part of ceremonial practice, connecting the living world to the realm below. Limited investigation of Chinkultic's cenote has not yet produced the kind of extensive offering deposits documented at better-known ritual cenotes elsewhere in the Maya region, leaving open the question of what role, precisely, this particular body of water played in the ceremonial life of the city built around its edge. Was it approached with the same reverence given to ritual cenotes elsewhere, its depths considered a genuine passage to the underworld? Or did its significance lie primarily in the practical, life-sustaining resource of water itself, its symbolic weight secondary to its role in simply keeping the city alive? There is also the matter of Chinkultic's eventual decline, a pattern familiar across much of the Maya lowlands during the terminal Classic period, when many major centers experienced political fragmentation, population movement, and the gradual cessation of monumental construction and dated inscriptions. The causes proposed for this broader Maya transformation, drought, resource stress, warfare, political fracture, likely apply in some combination to Chinkultic as well, though the site's specific experience of that decline has not been reconstructed in the same fine-grained detail achieved at more extensively excavated Maya centers. Standing today at the edge of Chinkultic's acropolis, looking down into the still, dark water of the cenote below, it becomes difficult to separate what has been documented from what remains, quite literally, unplumbed. The stele record dates and rulers with mathematical precision, yet the deeper currents of belief, the reasons this particular threshold between land and water was chosen as the heart of a city, remain considerably less certain. What did the people of Chinkultic believe waited beneath the surface of that lake, and how much of their city's fuller story still rests, undisturbed, in water whose depths have never been fully measured? Consider for a moment how often this exploration has returned to the same quiet puzzle: a settlement too sophisticated, too well connected, too early for the isolated place it occupied. We have seen it in the deserts of Arabia, in the highlands of Chiapas, in the sand-swept mound of Bahrain. It surfaces once more, perhaps more forcefully than anywhere before, in the mountain valleys of Central Asia at a site called Sarazm, in what is now western Tajikistan. Sarazm sits in the Zeravshan Valley, cradled by mountains that rise steeply on either side, a landscape that today feels remote even by the standards of Central Asia. And yet beneath its soil lie the remains of one of the oldest known urban settlements in this entire region, dating back to approximately 4000 BC. This places Sarazm's earliest occupation contemporary with early Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization, a genuinely startling fact given the site's location, thousands of kilometers from the river valleys most closely associated with the earliest rise of complex human settlement. Excavations at Sarazm, conducted since the 1970s under Soviet and later Tajik archaeological teams, have revealed a settlement of considerable sophistication for its era. Multi-room mud brick houses, evidence of metallurgy, including some of the earliest known tin-bronze production in Central Asia, and perhaps most strikingly, clear evidence of long-distance trade connecting Sarazm to civilizations spread across an extraordinary geographic range. Lapis lazuli, likely sourced from Afghanistan. Turquoise, probably from what is now Uzbekistan or Iran. Shells from the distant waters of the Indian Ocean, carried inland across mountain and desert to reach this valley settlement. Sarazm, it seems, sat at the crossroads of trade networks stretching from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia, a mountain waypoint linking civilizations that, on a map, appear to have little reason to intersect at all. What makes Sarazm's story particularly compelling is the question of why, precisely, a settlement of this scale and connectivity emerged in this specific valley. The Zeravshan Valley does offer access to metal ore deposits, and the region's tin resources may well have been a significant draw, feeding into the wider Bronze Age demand for tin bronze across the ancient world, a demand that shaped trade networks from the Aegean to the Indus. This practical explanation accounts for much of what Sarazm's excavated material reveals, a community organized substantially around metallurgical production and the trade relationships that production made possible. And yet, the scale of Sarazm's connectivity raises a further, less easily answered question. How did a settlement in this comparatively remote mountain valley maintain trade relationships spanning such enormous distances, using technology and transportation methods available in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC? The logistics alone, moving goods across mountain passes, through deserts, along river corridors that connected but did not always cooperate with human travel, imply organizational capacity and geographic knowledge that seem remarkable for a settlement operating so early in the broader Bronze Age timeline. Some researchers have proposed that Sarazm functioned within a wider, still incompletely mapped network of Central Asian settlements, each serving as a node passing goods and knowledge along a route we might now recognize as an early predecessor to the later Silk Road, an exchange network whose Bronze Age origins may run centuries, even millennia, deeper than the term's more famous historical usage suggests. There is also the matter of Sarazm's eventual decline, which occurred gradually across the 2nd millennium BC, its population dispersing for reasons that remain genuinely unclear. Environmental change, shifting trade patterns, or perhaps the gradual absorption of Sarazm's population into other, better documented Bronze Age Central Asian cultures have all been proposed. Yet none has been definitively confirmed by the archaeological record left behind. The settlement simply fades from the evidence, its houses abandoned, its metallurgical workshops falling silent, leaving behind only the material traces of what it had once accomplished. Sarazm was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010, recognized specifically for its role as one of the earliest testimonies to urban settlement in Central Asia and to the ancient exchange networks connecting the region to civilizations far beyond its mountains. Yet, recognition has not fully resolved the deeper questions the site continues to raise. How did knowledge of metallurgy, of long-distance trade routes, of urban organization itself reach this valley so early? And from where precisely did that knowledge first arrive? Standing in the Zarafshan Valley today, surrounded by mountains that seem, at first glance, to isolate rather than connect, it becomes difficult to reconcile the landscape's apparent remoteness with the extraordinary reach Sarazm's excavated material implies. What unmapped routes, what forgotten relationships between distant Bronze Age peoples first drew traders into this valley, and how much of that ancient network still remains entirely unknown to us, waiting somewhere in the unexcavated ground beyond Sarazm's current boundaries. West now, away from the mountain valleys of Central Asia, back across deserts and rivers to the fertile plains of northwestern Syria, where the Orontes River carves its patient path through the Gabe Valley. Here, rising unassumingly from the surrounding farmland, sits a mound that has quietly accumulated one of the longest, most continuous settlement records in the entire Near East. Tel Karkur. To the casual eye, Tel Karkur looks like countless other tells scattered across the region. A gentle rise in otherwise flat terrain, grass and scrub covering slopes that conceal rather than reveal what lies beneath. But excavations conducted since the 1980s, led by American and international teams working alongside Syrian archaeologists, have uncovered a sequence of occupations stretching back roughly 10,000 years, from the Neolithic period through the Bronze and Iron Ages, and onward into the Classical and Islamic eras. Few sites anywhere offer such an unbroken window into the accumulated layers of human settlement, generations stacked upon generation, each building directly atop the achievements and failures of those who came before. Tel Karkur's name carries particular weight for a specific reason. Ancient Assyrian inscriptions identify a city called Karkar as the site of a major battle in 853 BC, when a coalition of regional kings, including Ahab of Israel, confronted the expanding Assyrian Empire under Shalmaneser III. The Assyrian king's own inscriptions boast of a decisive victory, claiming immense casualties inflicted upon the coalition forces. And yet, the archaeological record at Tel Karkur tells a noticeably quieter story. Excavations have found no clear evidence of the kind of large-scale destruction layer one might expect from a battle of the scale Shalmaneser's inscriptions describe. No burn layer consistent with a city sacked in the aftermath of catastrophic defeat, no mass grave or battlefield debris confirming the coalition's reported losses. This discrepancy sits at the heart of Tel Karkur's enduring puzzle. Mainstream historians generally treat Assyrian royal inscriptions with appropriate caution, recognizing that ancient rulers frequently exaggerated victories, inflated enemy casualties, and shaped official records to serve propaganda purposes rather than strict historical accuracy. Under this reading, the Battle of Karkar likely occurred, and likely ended in some kind of Assyrian tactical advantage, but the overwhelming victory described in Shalmaneser's own account may simply reflect the self-aggrandizing conventions of Assyrian royal record-keeping rather than events as they actually unfolded on the ground. It is a reasonable, well-supported explanation, consistent with how we understand royal inscriptions functioned across the ancient Near East more broadly. But the absence of expected destruction evidence leaves room for other questions to linger. Did the battle actually take place at this specific tell, or does the ancient name Karkar refer, in some accounts, to a location not yet definitively pinned to this exact site, leaving open the possibility that the famous confrontation occurred nearby, its precise location still misattributed by the identification archaeologists have long assumed? Excavation continues to refine this picture, yet the gap between text and trench remains only partially closed. What deepens Tel Karkur's mystery further extends well beyond the battle itself. reaching back into the site's much older Neolithic layers. Evidence recovered from these earliest occupation phases points to one of the region's early transitions toward settled agricultural life, communities gradually shifting from mobile foraging toward permanent settlement, animal domestication, and the earliest organized farming practiced anywhere in this part of the Near East. Understanding precisely how and why this transition occurred at Tel Karkur, what specific combination of environmental pressure, social innovation, and available resources pushed early inhabitants toward permanent settlement, remains an active area of ongoing research, one complicated considerably by the difficulty of continuing fieldwork in Syria, given the political instability of recent years. That instability itself has become part of Tel Karkur's more recent unfortunate story. Archaeological work at the site, along with countless others across Syria, was significantly disrupted by the conflict that began in 2011, leaving portions of the Tel's deeper history, its earliest Neolithic foundations especially, still only partially understood, their fuller excavation deferred indefinitely by circumstances entirely outside archaeology's control. Standing, at least in imagination, atop Tel Karkur's modest rise, looking out across the Gabe Valley's fertile plain, it becomes difficult not to wonder how much of this site's layered history, the true scale of a battle recorded so differently by victor and by soil, the precise mechanisms behind humanity's earliest steps toward settled life, remains locked beneath ground that current circumstances have not yet allowed us to fully read. What really happened on this plain in 853 BC, and how much more of Tel Karkur's 10,000-year story still waits, undisturbed, for a moment when the ground beneath it can once again be safely opened to careful, patient study. Ground that has waited, undisturbed, for careful study to resume, is precisely where we turn now, though the waiting here has lasted far longer, and the ground itself tells a story written not in mud brick or battle record, but in a careful arrangement of basalt stones on a quiet plain in southeastern Australia. This is Wurdi Yoang, near Little River in Victoria, a site that may represent one of the oldest deliberately constructed astronomical structures anywhere on Earth. Wurdi Yoang consists of an egg-shaped arrangement of stones, roughly 50 meters across at its widest point, set upon a low volcanic plain within the traditional lands of the Wathaurong people. At first glance, the arrangement might seem unremarkable, low stones set into grass and earth, easily overlooked by anyone unaware of what they were looking at. Yet, careful study of the arrangement's geometry has revealed something considerably more deliberate. 3 larger stones positioned along the site's axis appear to align with the setting sun at the solstices and equinox, their placement seemingly calibrated to mark the sun's extreme positions on the horizon across the changing seasons of the year. This alignment was first analyzed in detail by researchers including Duane Hamisher, whose work on Aboriginal astronomical traditions has helped bring renewed scholarly attention to sites like Wurdi Yoang, long known to local Aboriginal communities but historically under-examined within mainstream Western archaeology and astronomy. The precision of the solstice and equinox alignments has led some researchers to propose that Wurdi Yoang may represent one of the oldest surviving astronomical structures in the world, potentially predating Stonehenge and the megalithic astronomical sites of ancient Egypt by a considerable margin, depending on how the site's age is ultimately determined. And there, precisely, lies the heart of the difficulty. Unlike stone circles in Britain or dolmens across the Levant, Wurdi Yoang's exact age has proven extraordinarily difficult to pin down using conventional archaeological dating methods. The stones themselves cannot be dated directly, and the surrounding volcanic plain offers few of the organic materials, charcoal, bone, seed, that radiocarbon dating typically requires. Some researchers have suggested the arrangement could be many thousands of years old, potentially placing its origins deep within the last ice age, based partly on geological analysis of the volcanic plain itself and the time frame during which its basalt would have been exposed and available for use. Other scholars urge considerably more caution, noting that, without direct dating evidence, estimates of extreme antiquity remain speculative, and that the stones could, in principle, have been arranged at any point across a very long span of Aboriginal occupation of this landscape, occupation itself now understood to extend back over 65,000 years across the Australian continent. This uncertainty is not a failure of research so much as a reflection of a genuinely difficult archaeological problem, one that sits at the intersection of oral tradition, landscape geology, and the limits of current scientific dating techniques. Aboriginal oral traditions across Australia are known to preserve information across extraordinarily long timescales, in some documented cases apparently retaining accurate memory of geological and coastal events dating back many thousands of years, transmitted with remarkable fidelity through generations of careful, structured storytelling. Could oral knowledge connected to Wurdi Yuang similarly preserve information about the site's original purpose and age, knowledge not yet fully documented or not yet shared beyond the custodianship of Wathorung knowledge holders themselves? The question sits respectfully outside the reach of conventional archaeological method, resting instead within a domain of cultural knowledge that science alone cannot fully access. What deepens the site's significance further is what it suggests about the broader, still incompletely understood tradition of Aboriginal astronomical knowledge across Australia. Wurdi Yuang is not an isolated example. Aboriginal traditions across the continent include documented systems of sky knowledge, seasonal calendars tied to stellar positions, and oral narratives explaining celestial phenomena with observational sophistication that researchers have only begun to seriously document and study in recent decades. If Wurdi Yuang does represent a deliberately constructed solstice marker, it would stand as material evidence of an astronomical tradition considerably older and considerably more sophisticated than has historically been credited within mainstream accounts of ancient astronomy, accounts that have often centered attention on Europe, Egypt, and Mesoamerica, while overlooking comparable achievements elsewhere. The stones of Wurdi Yuang remain exactly where they have long stood, low and unassuming against the volcanic plain, their alignment with the setting sun continuing, season after season, regardless of how confidently we can date their placement. Traditional custodians and researchers alike continue to study the site, balancing scientific method with respect for Aboriginal knowledge systems that may hold answers no radiocarbon test could ever independently confirm. How old is this arrangement truly? And what did the people who built it understand about the sky above this quiet plain that we, even now, are only beginning to fully appreciate? Wind across an open plain, low stones catching the last light of a setting sun. That same quiet, patient light now falls instead across rolling hills further north and west, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, where the sun rises each morning over ground that may hold the very origins of settled human life itself. This is Jarmo, in what is now northeastern Iraq, a site whose modest mound conceals one of the most consequential chapters in the entire human story. Jarmo sits in the foothill zone of Iraqi Kurdistan, a landscape of rolling terrain and seasonal rainfall sufficient, even without irrigation, to support the wild ancestors of wheat and barley that once grew here naturally. Excavated primarily during the 1940s and 1950s by American archaeologist Robert Braidwood and his team, Jarmo has come to occupy a foundational place in our understanding of the Neolithic Revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering toward settled agricultural life that reshaped human society more profoundly than perhaps any development before or since. Dated to approximately 7000 BC, Jarmo represents one of the earliest known farming villages anywhere in the world. Excavations uncovered mud brick houses, storage pits, and, most significantly, evidence of early domesticated wheat, barley, and legumes alongside the bones of domesticated goats and possibly early domesticated pigs. Stone tools, including sickle blades still bearing the characteristic sheen left by cutting cultivated grain, confirm that the inhabitants of Jarmo were not simply gathering wild plants, but actively cultivating them, tending fields, and gradually reshaping the genetic makeup of the crops they depended on, a process that would, over succeeding millennia, produce the domesticated staples that continue to feed much of humanity today. The mainstream narrative surrounding Jarmo situates it within the broader story of the Fertile Crescent, the arc of territory stretching from the Levant through Mesopotamia, where agriculture is understood to have developed independently, driven by a combination of environmental pressure, population growth, and the accumulated ecological knowledge of communities who had spent countless generations studying the plants and animals around them. Under this reading, Jarmo represents not a sudden invention but the visible, well-preserved evidence of a gradual, centuries-long process by which a foothill community incrementally shifted from foraging toward farming, testing, refining, and eventually depending upon the crops that had once simply grown wild around their seasonal camps. Yet, Jarmo's excavated record raises questions that this gradualist explanation does not fully resolve. The sheer completeness of the site's early agricultural toolkit, sickles, storage facilities, evidence of multiple domesticated species present already in the site's earlier layers, has led some researchers to ask whether the transition at Jarmo occurred more rapidly than the traditional model of slow, incremental domestication comfortably allows. Was Jarmo an early adopter of agricultural techniques developed elsewhere, knowledge and seed stock arriving through contact with other, even earlier experiments in cultivation, not yet identified in the archaeological record? Or does Jarmo's evidence simply reflect the genuine speed with which a sufficiently motivated community, facing the right combination of environmental opportunity and necessity, could transform its entire relationship with the natural world within a remarkably compressed span of generations? There is also the deeper, more unsettling question of what, precisely, motivated this transformation in the first place. Hunting and gathering, in an environment as naturally productive as the Zagros foothills appear to have been, likely provided a reasonably stable, arguably less labor-intensive subsistence strategy than early farming, which demanded sustained physical effort, vulnerability to crop failure, and a level of sedentary commitment quite different from the flexibility hunter-gatherer life typically allowed. Why, then, did the people of Jarmo, and communities like them scattered across the wider Fertile Crescent, choose a path that current archaeological and anthropological analysis increasingly suggests may have initially made daily life harder, not easier? Some researchers point to population pressure, forcing communities to intensify food production even at increased individual cost. Others suggest climatic instability at the end of the last ice age destabilized the wild resources hunter-gatherers had long depended upon, making cultivation less a choice than a necessity. The full answer likely involves some combination of these pressures. Yet the precise balance, the specific tipping point that pushed Jarmo's inhabitants across this threshold, remains only partially reconstructed. Braidwood's excavations, though foundational, represent only a fraction of what the wider Zagros foothill region likely still holds. Other early farming sites almost certainly remain undiscovered or only partially studied across this same landscape, their evidence waiting to refine or perhaps complicate the picture Jarmo has provided. What exactly tipped the balance in this quiet stretch of foothill country toward a way of life that would eventually reshape nearly every human society on Earth? And how much of that pivotal, world-altering decision still lies buried beneath these unassuming hills, waiting for the next generation of careful excavation to bring it fully into the light.